I grew up moving all over the place. By the time I hit 10th grade, I'd lived in 10 different places. Math is extraordinarily sequential. And by the time I'd hit 3rd grade, I'd fallen off the math bandwagon. Basically, I flunked my way through elementary, middle, and high school math and science. So it's a little strange looking back now because today I'm a professor of engineering and I'm passionate about my job. One day, one of my students found out about my past and he asked me, "How did you do it? How did you change your brain?" And I thought, how did I do it? I mean, here I was, this little kid, and I just loved language and culture, and that's all I wanted to learn when I grew up. But I didn't have the money to go to college, so I enlisted in the Army right out of high school to learn a language. And you can see me there looking very nervous, about to throw a grenade. And I did learn a language. I learned Russian, and I ended up working out on Soviet trawlers up on the Bering Sea as a Russian translator. So I just loved adventure and getting new perspectives. So I also ended up in Antarctica at the South Pole Station, and that's where I ended up meeting my husband. So I always say, I had to go to the end of the earth to meet that man. But I began to realize something, though. I was doing all these adventures and seeing these new perspectives, but somehow they were always external. They weren't internal. I wasn't changing inside. When I'd worked in the military, I'd worked with all these West Point engineers, and they had these powerful techniques for problem solving. And I thought, I'd look sometimes at what they were doing, and they had these calculus and physics books, and it looked like hieroglyphics to me. But I thought, what if I could get those ideas? What if I could learn that language? I mean, the world's evolving. Language and culture are important, but math and science and technology are important too. What if I could learn these new ideas and add them to the ideas I already knew and loved? So when I got out of the military at age 26, I decided to try and change my brain. It wasn't easy. But if I knew then what I know now about how to learn, I could have learned much more easily and much more effectively. So several years ago, as I began trying to answer that student's question, how did I change my brain? I began reaching out to top professors from around the world, people who not only had knowledge of their difficult areas of expertise, but also who could teach effectively. And I asked them, I said, how did you learn? And how do you teach so others can learn? And what I found was the way they learned and the way they taught was often similar to the way I learned and I taught. It was almost like this kind of shared fraternal handshake. But we often didn't know why we did what we did. So I began researching neuroscience and cognitive psychology and reaching out to talk to top experts in those fields. And here is what I found: the keys to learning effectively. Now, as we know, the brain is enormously complex, but we can simplify its operation into two fundamentally different modes. The first is what I'll call the focused mode. And the focused mode is just like it sounds like. You turn your attention to something and boom, it's on. But the second mode is a little different. It's a relaxed set of neural states that I'll call the diffuse mode. It's a number of resting states. And so it seems that when you're learning, you're going back and forth between these two different modes. Now, how can we better understand these modes? Through analogy. And what we're going to use is a pinball machine analogy. And you all know how pinballs work. You just pull back on the plunger, and the ball goes boinking out and bounces around on the rubber bumpers, and that's how you get points. So what we're going to do is we're going to take this pinball, and we're going to put it right on your brain, right? So there it is. There's the pinball machine on your brain. And if you look, this is the analogy for the focus mode. And when you're learning, you're often thinking tightly as you're focusing on something. It involves thoughts you're somewhat familiar with, perhaps historical patterns, or you're familiar with the multiplication table. So you think a thought, and it takes off and moves along smoothly, pretty much along the pathways that you've already laid. But what if the thought you're thinking is actually a new thought, a new concept, a new technique that you've never thought of before? Well, that's symbolized by this new pattern towards the bottom of the pinball machine metaphor. To get to this new place, I mean, at least sort of metaphorically speaking, look at all the rubber bumpers that are in the way. How can you even get there? You need a different way of thinking, a new perspective, in a sense. And that's provided here by the diffuse mode. Look at how far apart those rubber bumpers are from one another. When you think a thought, it takes off, and it can range very widely as you're attempting to come up with some new ideas. So you can't do the careful focus thinking that you can in the focus mode, but you can at least get to the place you need to be in to grapple with these new ideas. So the bottom line for all of us out of this is this. When you're learning, you want to go back and forth between these modes. And if you find yourself, as you're focusing in on something, trying to learn a new concept or solve a problem, and you get stuck, you want to turn your attention away from that problem and allow the diffuse modes, those resting states, to do their work in the background. Now, how can we actually use these ideas in real life? If you look at this guy right here, he was Salvador Dali, one of the most brilliant surrealist painters of the 20th century. Dali was the very definition of a wild and crazy guy. You can see him there. He's got his pet ocelot, Babu. And what Dali used to do when he was kind of stuck as he was solving some problem related to his painting was he'd sit down and he'd relax in a chair, and he'd have keys in his hands. And he'd hold those keys, and he'd relax and kind of let his brain noodling away. And just as he'd relax so much that he'd fall asleep, the keys would fall from his hands, the clatter would wake him up, and off he'd go. He'd take those ideas from the diffuse mode over to the focus mode, where he could work with them, refine them, and use them for his painting. So you might think, well, that's great. You know, that's good for an artist. But I'm an engineer, so how can I use these ideas? Well, if you see this guy right here, he was Thomas Edison, one of the most brilliant inventors in history. And what Edison used to like to do, at least according to legend, he'd sit in a chair with ball bearings in his hand, and he'd relax away, kind of thinking about a problem loosely that he was trying to solve related to his inventions, relaxing, and then just as he'd fall asleep, the ball bearings would fall from his hands, and off he'd go. He'd be woken up, and he'd take those ideas from the diffuse mode back into the focus mode, and he'd use them to refine and finish his inventions. So the bottom line for all of us out of this is this. Whenever you're sitting down to solve a new problem or analyze a new idea, even if millions of other people have thought the same thoughts or solved the same problems, for you, it's just as creative as it was for famous people like Dali and Edison. And you want to use some of these creative approaches. So, but you might say to me, well, yeah, I've got a problem, though. You know, I love to procrastinate. I mean, this back and forth stuff is great, but I don't have time. I cram at the last minute, and that's just me. So let's talk just a little bit about procrastination. What seems to happen when you procrastinate is this. You look at something you'd really rather not do, and you actually feel a physical pain in the part of your brain that analyzes pain. So there's two ways that you can handle this. The first way is you can just kind of keep working away through it. And research has shown that within a few minutes, it actually will disappear. But the second way is you just turn your attention away, and guess what? You feel better, right away. So you do this once, you do this twice, it's just not that big a deal. But you do this very often, and it's actually like an addiction. It can really cause problems in how you lead your life. So how can you handle it? A very simple way, using the Pomodoro technique. The Pomodoro technique, as it turns out, all you need to do is you get a timer. Any timer will do. And then you just take it and set it for 25 minutes and make sure everything else is turned off. So no instant messages, nothing like that. And you work with focused attention for 25 minutes. Anybody can do 25 minutes, virtually anyone. And when you're done, you do something fun. Just a little bit, a few minutes of relaxed fun. What this seems to do is this. You are enhancing, you're practicing in some sense, your ability to have focused attention. And you're also practicing your ability to relax a little bit. And now you understand that relaxation is also an important part of the learning process. There's things going on in the background. The only thing is this. When you do the Pomodoro, you want to make sure that you don't sit there and say, I'm going to do my entire homework set in this 25 minutes. No. You just sit and say, I'm going to work with focused attention for 25 minutes. And that's the key. Now, students sometimes make the mistake of thinking that some of their absolute best traits are their worst traits. So what do I mean by this? Let's take the idea of memory. Let's say that you have a poor working memory. You can't seem to hold things in mind very well. You know, you'll watch these other students and they're able to grasp all these ideas and kind of manipulate them, but you can't. Well, what this means is, surprisingly, you are more creative. Because you can't hold these ideas in mind so tightly, other ideas are often creeping in. If you have problems with attention, you're always kind of diverting off into some other idea, it's similar. You are often more creative because these new ideas are slipping in instead. So there's another thing, and that's slow thinking. Some students compare themselves to other students and say, you know, I'm really slow by comparison. I mean, these other students, they're like race car drivers. They go past me so fast. But think of yourself as a hiker. Yes, a race car driver gets there much faster than you ever can. But a hiker has a completely different experience. A hiker can smell the pine air. They can reach out, touch the leaves. They see the rabbit trails. In many ways, your experiences are deeper and more profound, and you don't jump to conclusions. So if you're a slower thinker, yes, you may have to work harder in order to grasp the materials. But the trade-offs, in many cases, are well worth it. You gain solid mastery of what you're studying. So there is something called illusions of competence in learning. And what this means is you can study all day long and you can be spinning your wheels because you're not using effective study techniques. There is such a thing as test anxiety, but in many cases, surprisingly many, it arises because you've just come face to face with the scary bear. And that is that you have just learned that you are not a master of the material. Researchers with both critters and people are finding powerful insights into how we can learn most effectively. One of those ways is simply through exercise. exercise within a matter of a few days can increase our ability to both learn and to remember. And researchers are beginning to understand the neurophysiological pathways that allow this to occur. Tests. Tests are the best. Test yourself all the time. Give yourself little mini tests. Make flashcards, even in math and science. Mix them up. Study them in different places. And this brings me to homework. When you do a homework problem, never just work it once and put it away. Would you ever sing a song once and think you knew that song? No. Test yourself. Work that homework problem several times over several days until the solution flows like a song from your mind. Recall. When you're looking at a page as you're trying to learn something in a book, people's tendency is to highlight, right? There's something about the motion of the pen on the page that makes you think that it's actually going into your brain, but it often isn't. And so often, sometimes people will just reread, but that too is simply spinning your wheels. The most effective technique is simply to look at a page, look away, and see what you can recall. And doing this, as it seems, helps build profound neural hooks that help enhance your understanding of the material. And finally, don't be fooled by the erroneous idea that understanding alone is enough to build mastery of the material. Understanding is truly important, but only when combined with practice and repetition in a variety of circumstances can you truly gain mastery over what you're learning. So, in closing, I would like to say that learning how to learn is the most powerful tool you can ever grasp. Don't just follow your passions, broaden your passions, and your life will be enriched beyond measure.